They said this shrine was untouchable. They said the curse was unbreakable. But they lied, because the fire that consumed it didn't start on earth. When the city boy with nothing but a name challenged 2 centuries of fear, heaven didn't just answer, it struck the match. This isn't just a story about a fire. It's about the day an underdog broke a 7-generation curse with a single prayer. It's the dynamic the village said was impossible. You have to see the day the silence finally broke. Watch until the end, because your story is next.
They told us the fire would never go out, but they never told us what would happen when heaven decided to strike the match. Imagine standing in a village where the air is thick, not with oxygen, but with a heavy, suffocating fear that feels like a wet blanket over your chest. This isn't a fairy tale, it's the reality of Omu-Aye, a place where the shadows don't just move, they breathe, governed by a shrine that has held my lineage in a chokehold for 7 generations. I remember my grandmother's trembling hands every time she passed the iron gates of that grove, a silent reminder that in this village you don't own your destiny, the great I does. We were taught that the shrine was untouchable, a god of stone and blood that could strike a man dead for merely looking at it sideways. But let me tell you about the day the impossible became a pile of ash and why the city boy with nothing but a worn-out Bible became the most dangerous man the village elders had ever seen. Kofi wasn't a warrior. He was a software engineer from the city with a laptop bag and a heart that beat for a god the village had forgotten. He returned to Omu-Aye not to claim land, but to bury his father, the 4th man in his family to die at exactly 44 years old. The villagers whispered that it was the price of the grove, a spiritual tax paid in blood because Kofi's great-grandfather had once dared to dream of leaving. In the city, we talk about bad luck or systemic issues, but in the village, we know it's a generational chain that only grows heavier with time. You can't pray away what was signed in blood, the high priest had sneered at Kofi, his eyes like 2 pieces of cold coal. Your God lives in the bright lights of the city. He doesn't have the jurisdiction to cross the river into our darkness. That night, Kofi didn't pack his bags to flee back to the safety of the neon lights and paved roads. Instead, he did the one thing the village laws strictly forbade. He knelt on the very soil that was supposed to be his grave. While the village slept in the grip of a silence so deep it felt like a physical weight, Kofi began to speak, not in a shout, but in a whisper that carried the authority of a king. There is a specific kind of bravery that comes when you realize that if you don't break the chain now, your children will be the ones wearing it tomorrow. Kofi wasn't just praying for his life, he was suing the darkness for the decades of joy it had stolen from his mother and the potential it had drained from his brothers. F equals MA might be the law of physics in the city, but Kofi knew the spiritual law of faith plus authority equals transformation. He didn't ask the fire to fall, he simply told the mountain that its time was up. The atmosphere in the village began to shift. The crickets stopped chirping, and the wind, which usually howled through the trees, suddenly went dead still. It was as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting for the collision between a silent idol and a vocal creator. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the sky over Omu-Aye didn't turn blue, it turned a violent, brilliant orange. There was no lightning, no dry brush to catch a spark, and no kerosene poured by human hands. The shrine, the ancient stone-cold structure that had survived rainstorms and centuries, was suddenly engulfed in a flame so white it looked like a piece of the sun had fallen onto the earth.
The elders rushed out, their charms and amulets useless in their hands, watching as the great eye was consumed by a fire that didn't just burn, it purified. People didn't just see a building collapse, they saw the expiration date of their fear. The underdog city boy stood at the edge of the grove, not with a torch, but with tears in his eyes, watching the stronghold of 7 generations turn into a harmless pile of soot. The shrine caught fire by itself because when a believer stands on the impossible ground and refuses to blink, heaven has no choice but to respond. You might not have a physical shrine in your village, but maybe you have a shrine of debt, a shrine of depression, or a shrine of "this is just how my family is." The triumph of the underdog isn't about physical strength, it's about the moment you decide that the light inside you is more real than the darkness around you. Omuaye is no longer the village of the great eye, it's the village where the fire fell and the chains broke. If a single prayer could level a stronghold that stood for 200 years, what do you think is possible for your life if you refuse to stay silent? The morning after the fire didn't bring the smell of dawn, it brought the scent of scorched history. In the city, a fire is a tragedy you call the department for. In Omuaye, a fire that starts without a match is a declaration of war. By 6 a.m., the entire village stood at the edge of the sacred grove, staring at the heap of white ash where the great eye had stood for 2 centuries. The ancient mahogany pillars, which were said to be harder than iron, were gone. The stone altar, where the blood of countless goats had dried into a dark crust, had cracked down the middle like a piece of cheap glass. Kofi stood at the periphery, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. He looked like an underdog, a city boy who didn't belong in the dust, but his eyes were calm. He wasn't running. Then came the sound of the brass bells. High Priest Okoro emerged from the shadows of the forest, his skin painted with the white chalk of the ancestors. He didn't look like a man of God, he looked like a man whose bank account had just been deleted. For 30 years he had held the village's health, their marriages, and their harvests hostage. "Who brought the kerosene?" Okoro roared, his voice shaking the morning mist. He didn't look at the villagers, he looked straight at Kofi. To Okoro, Kofi represented the modern poison, the education, the city logic, and the Christian faith that threatened his monopoly on power. "My father's gods are not mocked," Okoro hissed, stepping toward Kofi. "You think your Jesus can protect you from the curse of this soil? By sundown, your tongue will swell in your mouth. By tomorrow, your heart will stop, just like your father's."
The villagers gasped, drawing back. In Omuaye, a curse from Okoro was a death sentence. It was the impossible dynamic, the ancient weight of tradition versus the solitary spark of a new faith. Kofi didn't flinch. He took a step forward, crossing the invisible line into the charred remains of the grove. "Baba," Kofi said, his voice steady, "I didn't bring kerosene. I didn't bring a lighter. I didn't even bring a match. I brought a name." He pointed to the cracked altar. "If your God is so powerful, why couldn't he blow out the flame? If he's the protector of this village, why is he currently sitting in a pile of ash? You say my God lives in the city lights, but last night he showed you that he owns the darkness too." This is the moment every underdog waits for, the moment where the bully's shadow is revealed to be nothing but smoke. Kofi wasn't just arguing, he was dismantling a spiritual system that had kept his people in poverty for generations. While the village elders spent their money on sacrifices to appease a silent idol, the children went without schools and the sick went without medicine. A murmur started in the crowd. It wasn't a murmur of fear, but of realization. Mama Ngozi, an elderly woman who had lost 3 sons to the grove's demands, stepped forward. She looked at the ash, then at the high priest,
then at Kofi. "The fire didn't spread to the trees," she whispered, her voice growing stronger. "The bushes right next to the shrine are still green. This wasn't a bushfire. This was a targeted strike." The village saw the Christian twist in real time. It wasn't a religion of thou shalt not. It was a power that liberated. If the shrine was gone, the price of the grove was canceled. The debt was paid. The generational curse that had capped the lives of the village men at 44 was incinerated in that white-hot flame. Imagine this, a village that had been silent for 200 years suddenly breaking into a shout. Not a shout of war, but a shout of relief. Okoro tried to chant a final incantation, his voice rising in a desperate, jagged rhythm. But the atmosphere had changed. The frequency of the village had shifted from the low hum of dread to the high vibration of victory. Kofi opened his Bible to the book of Elijah and read aloud, his voice drowning out the priest's chants. "The God who answers by fire, he is God." As he spoke, a wind blew through the grove, scattering the ashes of the shrine toward the river. Within an hour, the untouchable high priest Okoro walked back into the forest alone, his authority stripped by a fire he couldn't explain. We all have a village we come from, a place where people say, "No one from this family ever succeeds," or "This sickness is part of our DNA." The story of the day the shrine caught fire isn't just about a building in Africa. It's about the fact that light doesn't negotiate with darkness. It simply occupies the space. The city boy won because he realized he wasn't fighting a priest. He was reclaiming a legacy. The underdog triumphed because he knew that one man plus God is always the majority. The fire is still burning today, but it's no longer in a grove. It's in the hearts of those who saw the smoke and realized they were finally free to dream. The ash was still warm when the first shovel hit the ground. In the city, we call it urban renewal. In Omuaye, it was called a resurrection. You see, when a stronghold falls, it doesn't just leave a hole in the ground, it leaves a vacuum of power. For decades, the high priest Okoro had told the villagers that the soil of the grove was cursed, that if a seed was planted there, it would grow into a serpent. But Kofi stood in the center of that charred circle, holding a bag of architectural blueprints instead of a bowl of ritual blood. The fire didn't just take the wood and the stone, it took the ceiling off your dreams. This ground isn't cursed, it's finally clean. Imagine the impossible sight. The very men who used to tremble and shield their eyes as they walked past the grove were now standing on top of the altar's remains, breaking the stone into gravel for a foundation. The triumph of the underdog isn't just winning the fight, it's building something beautiful on the battlefield where everyone expected you to die. Kofi's cousins from the city arrived 2 days later in a white pickup truck loaded with bags of cement and solar panels. This was the city versus village dynamic shifting in real time. The city wasn't coming to exploit the village, the city was coming to empower it. "You're crazy, Kofi," Kofi's cousin Tunde whispered, looking at the skeletal remains of the shrine. "The elders in the city are saying you've started a war you can't win. They say the great eye will follow you back to your apartment in Lagos." Kofi pointed to a group of village children who were playing tag for the first time in history, right where the inner sanctum used to be. "Look at them, Tunde," Kofi replied. "They aren't afraid. Fear is a habit, and the fire just broke the cycle. You can't curse what God has already bleached white with his own flame." This is the Christian twist that goes viral. It's not just a prayer, it's a practical takeover. They weren't building another shrine to a new God. They were building a vocational center. Where people once came to beg for their lives, they would now come to learn how to change them. The real test came 6 months later. It was Kofi's 44th birthday. The village held its breath. The generational curse was supposed to collect its tax. In the shadows of the forest, the disgraced high priest Okoro waited, his eyes fixed on Kofi's house, waiting for the wail of a grieving widow to break the silence of the night. But midnight came and went. The sun rose on a village that smelled of fresh paint and blooming hibiscus.
Kofi didn't wake up with a swollen tongue or a stopped heart. He woke up, put on his work boots, and walked to the new center to teach the first class on digital literacy.
When he stepped onto the porch, the village was waiting, not with funeral shrouds, but with a cake. The impossible had been defeated. The stopwatch of death that had ticked for 7 generations had finally run out of batteries. The underdog hadn't just survived, he had redefined what normal looked like for every boy and girl in Omuaye. Today, if you visit the spot where the shrine once stood, you won't find a trace of the Great Eye. You'll find a library with high-speed internet powered by the very sun the priests said would burn the infidels. You'll find women who no longer pay protection money to an idol, but instead invest that money into their children's university fees. The story of the day the shrine caught fire by itself traveled far beyond the borders of the village. It became a digital anthem for every person trapped in a village of their own making, whether that's a toxic family history, a cycle of poverty, or a spirit of fear. The fire proved one thing: darkness only looks solid until the light decides to walk through it. The world watched Omuaye go from a place of no return to a place of new beginnings. And the best part? The fire that started that night didn't stop at the grove. It moved into the houses, into the schools, and into the very DNA of a people who finally realized that their God wasn't just big, he was local. You've stayed till the end because you know there's a shrine in your life that needs to go. Maybe it's a habit, a history, or a heavy heart. The miracle of Omuaye wasn't just the fire, it was the man who was willing to pray until the spark fell. You are the underdog of your own story, and heaven is just waiting for you to stop negotiating with the high priests of your past. The most chilling part of a miracle isn't the noise it makes when it arrives, it's the silence it leaves behind when the enemy finally realizes he's outmatched. For 3 days after Kofi's 44th birthday, High Priest Okoro was nowhere to be found. The village was buzzing, the vocational center was humming with the sound of laptop keyboards, and the air felt light. That's the only way the villagers could describe it. The heavy, metallic taste of fear that had sat on their tongues for decades had evaporated, replaced by the scent of rain and opportunity. But then, on the 4th day, the impossible dynamic took one final desperate turn. They found Okoro at the edge of the Omu River, the boundary between the village and the civilized world. He wasn't wearing his priestly robes, he was dressed in rags, his eyes bloodshot and wandering. He was trying to summon the water spirit, the last line of defense in his spiritual arsenal. "The fire took the wood," he screamed at the gathering crowd, "but the water will take the boy. The river doesn't burn, Kofi. The river remembers." The villagers paused. Even with the shrine in ashes, the old superstitions were like deep scars. They throbbed when the weather changed. They looked at the dark, swirling eddies of the Omu River, a place where many had drowned under mysterious circumstances. Kofi walked to the water's edge. He didn't bring a choir, and he didn't bring a megaphone. He brought a cup. In the city, we treat water as a utility. In the village, it's a deity. But Kofi knew that the God who answers by fire is also the God who walked on the waves. "Baba Okoro," Kofi said, dipping the cup into the murky Omu River water, "for 70 years this man told you not to fish in these depths because the spirits were hungry. He told you not to build a bridge because the spirits were angry. He used the impossible to keep you in poverty while he ate the best of your harvests." Then Kofi did the unthinkable. He drank the water. The crowd gasped. The river was known to carry parasites and, according to legend, the breath of death for anyone who didn't offer a sacrifice first. Okoro watched, his mouth agape, waiting for Kofi to collapse, to choke, to be dragged in by an invisible hand. 10 seconds passed, 30, a minute. Kofi wiped his mouth and smiled. "It's a bit muddy, but it's just water. And by next month, we're installing the filtration system right here. No more sacrifices, Baba. Just clean pipes."
This was the final nail in the coffin of the generational curse. The underdog had systematically dismantled every fear-based stronghold. The fire proved the idols were flammable. The birthday proved the curse was a lie. The river proved that nature was just nature under the feet of its maker. The high priest didn't vanish in a puff of smoke. He did something much more realistic and much more devastating to his ego. He sat down on the mud and wept. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had been a slave to the same darkness he was peddling. The story of Omuaye didn't stay in the village. It hit the city like a tidal wave. People started posting about it on social media, how a single man's refusal to fear had flipped a century-old script. Young Nigerians, Ghanaians, and Kenyans began sharing their own shrine stories, not just physical shrines, but the shrines of corruption in their offices, the shrines of mediocrity in their schools. The day the shrine caught fire became a metaphor for the moment you realize that your giant is actually a midget in a costume. As the sun set on Omuaye, the lights from the vocational center flickered on. From a distance, the village no longer looked like a dark spot on the map to be avoided. It looked like a city on a hill.
Kofi stood on the porch of his father's house, the house he was supposed to die in, and looked at the stars. He realized that the fire didn't just burn down a building, it cleared the field so he could finally see the sky. The generational curse wasn't broken by a sword, it was broken by a man who decided that the way it's always been wasn't the way it has to be. You are the narrator of your own African story. You are the one who decides if the fire stays in the fireplace or if it consumes the strongholds holding you back. The viewers who stayed until the end of this narration are looking for one thing: proof. Proof that God is still in the business of intervening in impossible dynamics. Proof that being an underdog is just a setup for a spectacular comeback. The smoke has cleared over Omuaye, but the fire is just beginning in your spirit. You've watched Kofi stand where his fathers fell. You've seen the great eye turn to a pile of gray dust. You've witnessed the moment an underdog realized that his God doesn't need a permit to invade a dark place. But this story isn't just about a village in the distance, it's about the impossible dynamic sitting in your own living room right now. What is the shrine in your life that everyone says is untouchable? Is it a generational curse that says no one in your bloodline will ever stay married or keep a job? Is it a shrine of fear that keeps you from starting that business because people like us don't succeed? Is it a voice of the past that whispers you'll never live past a certain age or achieve a certain height? In the city, we call it a glass ceiling. In the village, they called it the great eye. Whatever you call it, it's a lie that has overstayed its welcome. I want you to stop negotiating with your shadows. Kofi didn't ask the shrine for permission to be free. He asked heaven for an intervention. If you are ready to see the impossible burn away, I want you to join me in this declaration right now. Close your eyes or look at that shrine in your life and say this with the authority of a survivor. Heavenly Father, you are the God who answers by fire. I identify every altar of fear, every throne of debt, and every generational chain that has tried to claim my future. I stop feeding the idols of my past. Today, I invite your holy fire to fall on the things I cannot change myself. Let the shrines of my life catch fire by themselves, and let me walk out of the smoke into a new day. In Jesus' name, amen. If you felt the atmosphere shift while watching this, don't keep the light to yourself. 1. Comment "The fire has fallen" below if you believe your chains are turning to ash today. 2. Share this video with one person who is currently fighting an impossible battle in their own village or city. 3. Subscribe to join this community of underdogs who are reclaiming their destinies.
The shrine didn't catch fire because Kofi was a superhero. It caught fire because he was a son who knew his father owned the matchbook. Go forth and walk through the smoke. Your promised land is on the other side. The fire that fell on Omuaye didn't just burn a building, it cleared the way for a future no one thought was possible. If you're ready to see the impossible become your reality, hit that subscribe button and join our community of fire starters. If you loved seeing Kofi break the chains, you need to see what happened in our other stories. Click on the left to discover the secret in my grandfather's trunk, or on the right to see the marketplace miracle of debt and integrity. Remember, your giant is only a midget in a costume. We'll see you in the next story.